I'm Barry Lee. I'm the director of esports at Evolve Talent Agency, and I represent esports players. And today on the panel with me are going to be Benjamin Mercke, and did I say that right?
It's actually like Mercke.
Mercke,
like
okay.
water. Everyone
Benjamin
gets
Mercke.
it wrong though, so not surprised.
And then Mike Schwartz, and then I'll let them introduce themselves.
All right. So I'm Mike Schwartz. I'm the general manager for the Los Angeles Valiant. It's an Overwatch League franchise, one of 20. So I handle pretty much all the day-to-day operations, signing players, making sure that everything's running smoothly in venue, dealing with Barry a lot on the player side. And then pretty much I wear all the hats in the org, so dealing with content as well.
Yeah, and then my name is Ben Mercke. I just actually recently started with a company called StreamElements, basically doing brand partnerships, brand strategy for different companies that want to come in and kind of support the streaming space and different esport teams.
So to start it off, since our panel's about the future of esports, as nebulous and as vague as that is, one thing that a lot of what we've been seeing from the game developer side is moving, going into esports as almost like a marketing vehicle. But at the same time, we've been seeing a lot of franchising happen. We saw it in Europe with the League of Legends European Championship, in North America with LCS and Overwatch, OWL, and there's a lot of hubbub around Call of Duty franchising. So, what are you guys' thoughts on just franchising in general and how that pertains to esports and its in the short term and long term future?
Yeah, I'll start off. Yeah, so coming from a franchise league, it's definitely interesting to see the growth where esports has started as a grassroots. Most of us are used to it from being in it for so long. The community starts up, and then the league forms around the grassroots. Want to be competitive. Whereas with Overwatch League, it actually starts from the top down. So Blizzard, as the publisher, comes up with the league, and they mandate what partnerships can and can't happen. They mandate, base regulations, which I think we see, has a lot of pluses and minuses, right? With the, they mandate minimum standards, which is great because, we kind of remove bad actors from a lot of those situations with that franchising. But I think from the endemic orbs that have been around that have been successful, they see it as much more restrictive in that end. So definitely one of the major things is around the partnerships category where Blizzard mandates what we can and can't have. So there's a lot of pushback and seeing okay, we want to do our own merchandising, but there's a deal with Fanatics that's in place, so we can't do our own personal merchandising, which, hurts some of our innovation in that space. But, for the newer orgs that are getting into esports, I think it sets a really good baseline for safety of the investment itself.
Yeah, just kind of adding to that, I actually was just recently with the Philadelphia Fusion Overwatch team doing partnerships. So I'm fairly familiar kind of with the franchise model as well in terms of how brands interface with just the league in general in a franchise model. It's definitely different than kind of what has happened in esports in the past, where brands are kind of an international type model, where now things like Overwatch League, they're moving it to a city-based league system. Now it is geographically tied to a destination, and that definitely presents, I think, opportunities for teams, but also potential drawbacks, and so it's just a matter of us kind of navigating those waters.
So in terms of kind of the future growth of esports, do you see franchising is staying because of the stability as a mainstay, or do you see potential to kind of go back to the more grassroots model where kind of the world's your oyster, I guess?
I think that's kind of that's an interesting question. So I think there's two sides of this coin, right? Where you've seen, teams really effectively build brands in the Overwatch League, similar to the Valiant. They have a great fan base. Their brand is very strong, and they have a great presence in the Overwatch League. And but now we're seeing things like the CDL that are popping up, the Call of Duty franchise league, which is essentially a mirror of the Overwatch League. We're going to launch with, I don't believe as many teams as the Overwatch League was launching with, but even just before this panel, you're seeing household name brands, international recognized brands like 100 Thieves that are announcing that they're not taking part in it. And so, I think inherently there are going to be challenges with, brands like Optic Gaming that are not going to be involved. And so that is definitely a hurdle that franchise leagues are going to have to to kind of get through. But if you look at brands like the Valiant, who have kind of taken their international brand model through MIBR and the Immortals and really translated it into a geographically tied system, I think it can work. So there are some that are doing it well, there are some that are not, and it's a matter of kind of everyone getting on the same page, I think.
Yeah, I think also coming in, there's some games that when those titles come out, like a franchise league might not make sense. So it really depends on what the publisher thinks, they want to accomplish. Blizzard being, such a large company that has multiple titles and IPs under it, it makes sense for them to create a franchise league because they have to scale and need to have safety for their investors that are getting into it. Whereas other games might feel more comfortable doing that grassroots model and having such a small niche fan base. Obviously that can grow pretty well, as we've seen with like Dota and all the Valve titles that they've gone without those franchise leagues. They've kind of put them out into ECS, EPL for like the CS:GO scene, and the open circuit for Dota, I believe. So both models can be successful. I think it just depends on the risk the investor is willing to take in putting it into those leagues.
I can definitely say from like the player side of things, the franchise model does give a lot of stability because it depends on league to league, but for the most part, players are generally guaranteed a certain amount of games that they will be able to play, be able to showcase their skills. And when there's problems with their teams, there's usually a league entity that they can fall back to keep the teams honest. That really depends on whether the league entity is willing to enforce a lot of that. Yeah. But in most cases, there is a fallback there. But now kind of, because you mentioned the IP aspect of it, and looking forward, a lot of stuff is just we're gonna have to worry about like IP kind of violations and like who owns the IPs and whatnot. Esports is in a little weird in a weird space compared to traditional sports on the IP side. So where do you guys kind of see that future clash, or like if there is a clash even?
I mean, right now, I think you're going to see with the evolution of like when you have influencers who come from being players, right? Like there's a triangular relationship between, the publisher owns the game and the content and like who actually they made it. Blizzard made Overwatch, right? But the player who streams it, and if they're creating something that's, I don't want to go into the fair use thing, but essentially it's like if the interactions the player is making or influencer is making, or if are they unique enough, are they transformative enough in that case to actually make it their own content.
The forbidden word.
Transformative use.
Yeah.
I wrote my thesis on that. So
yeah, I mean, sorry to cut you off, but yeah, I mean, that's like a big place that we're going. But on the branding side, like, on the IP and the branding, like having brands associated with specific IP, or like even like the brand of a player associate, or like a streamer associated with IP, like, what's your take on that, Ben?
Well, so I think I have a bit of a different perspective from working with a franchise team at the Fusion. Our situation was a bit different than that over at the Valiant, where we were an Overwatch League team first, and so we jumped headfirst into the franchise model without an internationally established brand behind us, and decided to kind of go the other method with that. And now they've kind of moved on and approached other things outside of the Overwatch League, but I definitely see that there are benefits and kind of having an internationally established brand behind you. Just working in partnerships for a team that was only in Overwatch, that's a bit of a tough sell when you're competing against Cloud9, MIBR, who all also have Overwatch League teams. And so when you're talking with even an endemic company, a company say a peripheral brand that is comfortable with this space, they understand it, they're used to spending money in it. Are they going to go with the single Overwatch League team, or are they going to go with, the Cloud9s or the MIBRs and get their Overwatch brand? And so it's kind of, I think it may be tough for teams that initially just jump in and establish as, hey, we're a franchise league. I think it can, in terms of branding, be very helpful to have 8 other games to brand in. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge pain point for a lot of teams, and even for individual streamers who are associated with esports, former players that end up being streamers. But besides the pain points, what are some things that are going well that you think will continue on in the future or continue to drive growth in the industry then?
Well, first off, I think establishing a brand in a city is a very healthy thing for esports in general. Coming from the Fusion, one of the things that we had was a wild fan base, and when we did fan parties and and fan events back in Philadelphia all the time, throughout the season.
What was that mascot? The Flyers mascot? That was
Gritty. The Flyers mascot, Gritty. So we would activate, the Philadelphia Flyers mascot kind of with the Fusion fan base, and we would host watch parties in Xfinity Live and fill the venue. I mean, that was 1,000 people showing up on a Thursday night to watch an Overwatch match, and so in terms of the franchise model, there are absolute massive benefits. You gain the ability to connect with a fan base on a level that you couldn't ordinarily do from the internet. And so I do think that there are massive branding opportunities, especially as Overwatch and the CDL move to their actual home markets. Initially the first 2 years were kind of on the internet and up in one location in LA. Now that they're going home, I think that you're going to start seeing partnerships really shift towards city level, and really starting to activate with local markets. And that, I think, is an extra added benefit of geographically locating to one spot.
Not even just on the geographic, which is 100% true, and I agree with Ben on that. There's also the aspect when esports haven't really been tied down to a city, and I think with doing that with the CDL and the Overwatch League, teams that have been historically player-driven, like people are fans of a certain player, and that's been historically the case in esports. And now you're actually tying it down to that city. So if you're an LA sports fan, you're going to be now like, oh, I'm a Valiant fan, because nobody wants to be a fan of the Gladiators. We can all agree on that, right? But
well, getting ahead of yourself.
Getting a little ahead of myself there. Yeah. But I think realistically, we'll start seeing that tie down to the LA, spot in the geography like Ben described. So I think that'll be healthier just for the ecosystem, where people know, like, this is my fan base, and they're not tied to, like, oh, we need to sign this influencer for our team. We need to have this personality to drive a ton of growth. Even though that will still help, I think actually being geographically situated will be much more beneficial and as a safety net for people coming in.
And I've definitely seen one of my, this is anecdotal, obviously, but a friend of mine who's from Boston, he's like, oh, I know nothing about Overwatch, but I hear we have a Overwatch team, so I guess I'm supporting them.
Exactly.
And hating on the New York teams. So there's a lot of that was going on, I think, when Overwatch was first announced. Then I guess kind of to move on to a next topic. Then I mean we've been touching on branding a lot, but do you see kind of the way brands have been kind of coming into the space, in working in partnerships and anything like that? How do you see that changing in the future, short term, long term, or will it even change at all?
I think you're going to see even more companies, from outside the gaming space trying to get involved. I think everyone right now is kind of looking at our industry, and they're like, we know that we need to be there. How do we be there? And how do we do it safely so that, we're not going to just throw a bunch of cash out the window? Because I think a lot of this is an experiment, but I think expanding brand activations, at a level where you're integrating with fans rather than just running ads. One thing that we have the ability to do in this space is interact and connect with people that you don't get on network television. You've got Twitch chat, you've got our social media platforms, you have all these different verticals that you can create content and engage with fans. And it's it's on people who work in branding and in partnerships to create ways for companies to come in and really have a healthy, full engagement with them, aside from just running ads.
So on Mike, from the team side then, I know you guys just had the Kit Kat rivalry weekend, so
Go ahead, yeah.
a lot of kind of on the because at first a lot of people were hesitant about that kind of branding, having it in front of everything, but then when you look at traditional sports, it's everywhere.
Exactly, yeah. So from us, we just put on the Kit Kat rivalry weekend, which is the last regular season weekend homestand for the Overwatch League for the Valiant franchise that we put on. And for that, we had a lot of different partners activate with us there. I mean, Kit Kat was the title partner, where we had the Kit Kat duos that were released, which are a mint dark chocolate thing, which is really cool. Bud Light coming in doing their own fan zone activation and lounge. As Ben was saying, it's really about the live experience that you can engage with at these events, right? It's not just going to be running ads on Twitch. It's not just going to be the viewership. It's going to be what can we do in venue to differentiate from everybody. And I think, from this weekend we saw, we brought an upper deck to do trading cards with people. We had our season ticket booth that we set up separately. We had a Bud Light area that we could do a meme booth. So how do we get these companies that are coming in? How do we uniquely activate with them? Which I think was what a lot of teams are going to start doing come in the future.
So you're expecting fans to get belligerently drunk off of Bud Light in the games in the future?
I mean, off a Bud Light, going into those games, I think if they're sitting around, like it's great for those partners to activate, right? You just have it like a regular sports type of event set up, right? If you're at arena, you're gonna go and be like, okay, well, I'm watching some Overwatch, but I want to get up and I want to do something else besides watch the competition. Cool, I'll get a Bud Light. I'll go get some Kit Kats. I mean, that's and it worked out really well for us in this first run. So.
Yep. I also think that kind of scales out to the franchise level, right? So kind of tying it back into what we were discussing earlier. Now with the Overwatch League and with the CDL, you're going to have, in the future, next few years, at bare bones minimum, 20 new esport arenas that teams have to compete in. And, that's further opportunities for companies to come in and at a more traditional level, activate their brands, right? A venue is something that companies, especially non-endemic companies to gaming, have been activating in for a long time. Sports arenas, football stadiums, everywhere. And so, this is another avenue where we can really expand kind of our market and bring companies in to activate and really give them a return that they understand, outside of just, impression and reach on live stream.
Okay. Seeing as this is kind of like a bulk of this conference is based on game developers and whatnot, where do you see this kind of relationship between the game developers and esports going in the future? Is it completely intertwined for all of time? If you want to have a competitive game, do you have to have an esports, or where do you see this going?
That's a big topic. You could probably do an entire panel on that topic itself.
Definitely, but
I think with some of the bigger games, you obviously see things like Overwatch. You have the top-down approach where they kind of created a game for esports. But then you see games like Counter-Strike, which wasn't necessarily an esport. It just ended up being one.
What was that game at E3 a year or two ago? They had some guy just live casting a pre-recorded thing. I remember this was on E3 and everyone's making fun of it, but we that kind of stuff shows that game devs are really thinking about it as a marketing vehicle, right?
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah, I think having esports as that marketing, it'll work for some. I don't think it's intertwined forever. I think there's going to be games that people will find a way to make it in some way competitive, and I think I don't think anyone thought Super Smash when it came out was going to be it's a great party game. That's how I would remember it. But then now it's an entire genre and scene itself.
Well, you can even talk about World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
And people are like, World of Warcraft esports, what's that?
Exactly. And there's two variations of it, right? There's the PvP variation where you're competing against players, and there's also the time component of that where you're just racing against the clock to see who can finish something faster.
Yep.
So I think you can. I think in terms of a market for it, you're carving out a niche, so as many of those you can hit, right? So there's some people who watch WoW Esports as the PvP, there's some people who watch it as the Invitational, but I think, overall, I think their most successful things have been Method's doing right now, the Race to World First, I think has been a great series, which isn't really as much of an esport, I would say, as it is an event. So I think differentiating off of that, but tapping into those bases are going to be important.
Yep.
So if you were talking to some game developer out here and they're saying, I'm releasing this game, I'm thinking of it's gonna be Plants vs. Zombies, Plants vs. Zombies esports, would you recommend that they go down developing their game with esports in mind, or?
I think having it in mind is always a good idea. Whether or not you're going to develop your game to be an esport title, though, I think is an entirely different question. I think my biggest advice to any game dev is to make a good game first, and typically people will find a way to make a competition out of it. That's kind of what people do.
Fair enough. Mike?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better than Ben there. I think, optimize, keep it in mind that, hey, can this blow up? And if so, what do we have to do as a developer to optimize it? But building a good game first is going to be the most important thing.
All right. We're a little strapped for time, but I do want to hit on one more topic. A lot of people see future of esports and even sports, really, gambling. So we see esports gambling, sports gambling, going to happen. So where do you see that kind of going into the future of esports in the short and long term?
You want to start with
Sure. I think it's a topic that gambling people are still debating if they want it to happen in certain states in in the United States, for that matter. Gambling's a big question. I think it can be tough because obviously a lot of the industry or fans of the industry are children. But if there is a way to properly regulate it gambling is a very large industry in itself, and it could be very beneficial. So if done properly, I'm kind of a fan of it. But if we're just going to let it run like the Wild West, like we're doing it even a few years back, I don't think that's the right road. So.
Yeah, I would say I agree as well. Like as long as it's regulated, we have to be cognizant that our demographic is going to be like that 14 to 20 like 7 group that is probably the most vulnerable for that. So being aware of like if game developers are putting in the loot boxing systems and seeing how those are going to transpire, like what are we going to do for those? But the sports betting industry is a multi-billion-dollar one, and like having those partnerships and having that cash flow coming into teams could be very beneficial as well. So again, as long as it's regulated, I'm all for it.
And especially we've seen, past in Korea with a lot of match fixing scandals, and like not even just in StarCraft, we've seen it in other esports as well. So it's something definitely, I think it just needs to be regulated. It seems to, seems to be a consensus.
It's tough to really find, a surefire way to say that those values are what they are. There's a lot of companies out there right now that are, data-focused companies that are just trying to provide different statistics to show the value that we have here. One thing I think that we all know is that there is a lot of value here, but what's the proper way of showing it? What's the proper way of showing return on any investment that we have in this space? And so, are teams worth exactly what they're being valued at right now? Maybe not, but I think that the potential exists because I do believe that the metrics are out there. It's just how do we track them? How do we show them?
And a lot of investment, I think, kind of adding on to that is based on perceived value. So you see a lot of teams coming in, a lot of investors coming in, looking at teams and saying, oh, I think it's going to be worth way much more than what we currently are buying in. So if they think it's a good deal, they'll buy in. But whether it's justified, that's the perennial question. Right?
Yeah, I think there's some teams that have like I think they're like 12x valuation, and like on a startup you'll never see that ever. Like it's just crazy. And then, but again, it's to Barry's point. I think it's on the perceived value that you're going to see. Where if you're looking at Overwatch, an example, like teams can't make their own merch. We're not even selling our own tickets yet. So there's so many avenues, and then obviously media deals with other companies. We're not even seeing that yet. So I think investors realizing like Blizzard's kind of keeping everything in that, restricted growth phase, and then once the teams can actually prove that they're stable, kind of letting them on their own, and then we can then focus on developing that revenue, which is what I think the investors are in that ride for. And I think if you get into it, you should know that it's not going to be a 2 to 5 year turnaround. It'll probably be 5 years plus that you're going to start seeing that ROI.
Obviously something. Franchise leagues not working out could be a big thing that could hurt us. I think. Us struggling to find a way to really show return on investment. You've seen big companies come in and get a massive round of investment funding behind them, and a year later they're out. So, I think it's perception, kind of getting back to our last question too, right? If a lot of people perceive this to be a dumpster fire, then maybe it is, and people get scared. But if we can find ways, and kind of tying back to what I was talking about earlier, if we can find ways to bring brands in, if we can find ways to get companies kind of invested in the market, and use this as more of a platform rather than a money-making opportunity, I think that in the long haul this does sustain itself. And so I think the biggest problem though is trying to make money quick, because this is not a quick money game. It's a long game.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Ben on that. That I think, especially one of the other problems in terms of franchising is if everyone decides to make a franchise league out of every esport possible, owners are gonna have to make those decisions of like, do I invest in X game or Y game? Am I going to be an Overwatch League team? Am I going to be a COD team? Am I going to be both? We're vertically integrated right now as IGC, where we have, our foot in pretty much every major brand. At the same time, if we have to contend with bringing on 6 more brands because everyone has a franchise league we're spending $10 to $20 million to get into, and if we feel like each of them is going to be impactful, like where do we draw that risk? And like the people who are getting in, if one of those leagues fails, it's like you lose a major part of your investment portfolio.
I think personally, and this is kind of skewed from my perspective as a player agent, is when teams end up start to ask for too much out of players in return for like what the teams are making. Right, as of now, it's a little like a lot of teams would like to say it's favored towards the players' side, which I may or may not agree with. I cannot say publicly. But regardless, like if we reach a point where the players are being cut out of a lot of the decision-making process, I think that's a big threat to it, because once the players stop playing professionally, and then they kind of drag down the whole esport, the specific, even one genre going down can, I think, threaten the entire ecosystem. So it's just a matter of, I think, managing expectations of players and making sure they're involved in the process and informed. I mean, I think it's gonna have to be a partnership. It's not like one side has the entire burden of a lot of it. And I think when a lot of people talk about this specific topic, I think they always end up skewing as like, oh, you know, this side's not doing enough for us to like help us out, like, you know, grow this whole thing. I think it genuinely has to be a partnership. And I think that's why the franchise model was so interesting, because you're codifying that partnership between the developer or the league, in this case, with the team. Because if the team works really hard to make sure the league is a good product, and then the developer making sure the game is the best that they can, so that, you know, the competition is good, then I think we're getting a good partnership where everybody benefits. So I think like thinking of it in terms of like, you know, what side has to really bring more to the table is, I think it's like a very narrow way of looking at it, and I think like people need to focus more on like how do they help each other, like kind of prop each other up. That's just my take on it. But
I also think if you look at I mean, the current ecosystem, right? We're a couple of years into, you know, massive franchise systems. You know, and if you look at the teams out there right now, what's the most valuable? And I would argue that it's probably not one of the Overwatch teams that paid $20 million for a slot. I'd argue it's one of the international-based brands, something like 100 Thieves. You know, as an example, and the only reason why is they came up earlier, but you know, they're across multiple games. So, someone like MIBR has a Counter-Strike team. They have an Overwatch, you know, based investment. They have teams across multiple verticals of games. And so, you know, I tend to lean towards the multi-game side, because I think in terms of branding, in terms of bringing companies in, you are just right off the bat more attractive. Not to say that that's the only way that you can be successful, because I do think that there are Overwatch brands that, you know, have specifically focused on the franchise model and have done very well for themselves. But I do think that it becomes inherently easier, at least in the current ecosystem. Whether or not that shifts, I'm not sure. I'm not a fan, though, of every single publisher becoming a franchise model.
Yeah, I would also say, just as well with the, you know, who's the burden on, like, again, as Barry said, it's going to be a partnership between both. I'm sure the game developer would love to say, like, hey, we're going to keep this and you guys do your own thing. And I think that does benefit some of the organizations, you know, if there's a bit of more freedom to actually go out and produce our own content and do our own things, like, we can see more success in that. But I think having the game developer kind of artificially restrict some of that growth, like I said before, and then share some of the revenue makes sense for the franchising leagues that are coming out, just as a safety net, and then, you know, over time kind of letting us go with that unrestricted growth. So I would say, you know, it's going to be that partnership where I think some revenue comes in from the game developer, but then they also have to kind of understand, like, the balance has to come where we get that autonomy to do what we need to do to generate other revenue.
okay, I think that's time. Sorry we couldn't get to your question, but happy to, you know, chat once we're down here. But yeah, I think we're done. So, you know, thank you for coming to the panel, and yeah, I'll hand it back.